It's my pleasure to introduce our seminar speaker today, Dr. Alison Haupt. Alison is a new or recent faculty member that started at CSU Monterey Bay back in January. I'm very excited to be able to introduce Alison because she is my second cousin, so it's really awesome to have a family member as a colleague in Monterey. A little bit about Alison's background. She was born in Monterey, and she had this tendency of leaving for a while, coming back. Monterey always kept drawing her back again, and you'll hear that as I tell you about her background. So she went to Monterey High. She got involved in diving when she was in high school. When I was in my undergrad, I came and lived with her family for a summer when I took the kelp forest ecology class at Hopkins, and I like to think that maybe he inspired her a little bit to go down this career path. She did her undergrad at UC Santa Barbara, and as an undergraduate, she probably did more research than most PhD students do. She spent a summer diving, studying Caledian kelp forests. She spent 9 months with one of my lab mates at the Galapagos. She went to St. Croix in the Virgin Islands, studied coral reef fishes, and she spent about 6 months working with Bob Stenek in Maine studying urchins. So she was all over the place doing research before she started grad school. Then she worked as a technician for Theo McKelly and started doing research down in Baja with her group, and then became a PhD student with Theo at Hopkins at Stanford, where she used population genetic tools to study larval dispersal, population connectivity, really, of two invertebrate species, 40 sea cucumbers and wavy turban snails. After she finished her PhD, then she went to UMass and worked with Jarrett Burns for a number of years before starting this position here. And I think some of the work she's going to tell us about today is what she was doing for her postdoc. And so with that, really excited to have Alison speak.
Thanks for having me. So as Scott said, we are second cousins, and marine biology doesn't really run in the family. We're kind of actually the outliers. But Scott is right. When he came and stayed with us when I was a junior in high school, and he was taking Jim Watanabe's kelp forest ecology class at Hopkins Marine Station, he did get me really excited about this. Summer I got certified as a scuba diver, and that summer I just thought Scott was the coolest thing in the whole world. And it's funny. It took me a while, so yeah, I started writing him letters when he went back to college, and a really good big cousin, he wrote back to me, which was really nice of him. But then I went to UC Santa Barbara as an undergrad, and the year after I started my freshman year there, Scott started as a PhD student, and that's when I actually got to know him as a real person and not this person I put up on a pedestal. And I learned that he was not nearly as cool as I thought he was. He was still pretty awesome and did really cool things, but he wasn't, this cool kid that I thought he was when he came and stayed with us when I was a high school student. So anyway, thanks so much for having me here today. So I'm sorry about the title that was on the flyers. I think back in June when Matt asked me to come talk, he asked me for a rough idea of what I might talk about, 4 months down the road, and I said, I might talk about this or I might talk about that, neither of which are really the things that are on the flyer. But what I am going to talk about is some work that I've done with a group of people thinking about whether or not cumulative impact indices are actually appropriate metrics for thinking about sort of the health or the status of California current ecosystems. And so first and foremost, I want to acknowledge my main collaborator on this work. My main collaborator here is Dr. Megan Mock, who is a fellow at the Center for Ocean Solutions. And this project was sort of born out of an ad hoc NCs working group. And then we joined forces with the Tipping Points project at Center for Ocean Solutions. And so Megan is a huge part of all of this work. There's many collaborators that went into this, but it's mainly been Megan and I working on it. And so, we already know, as all of us who go out and spend time on the ocean or around the ocean, that there are many different ways that humans impact the ocean. We have really direct ways, like creating harbors where we're actually manipulating coastline, or where we have commercial fishing, which is another really direct impact, where we're physically taking a lot of fish out of the ocean, fish or invertebrates. recreational fishing that can often be just as large an impact as commercial fishing. You know, if you think about those party boats in Southern California that take out a huge number of people every day, and every day all of those people catch their limits, that's operating just like a commercial fishery. It's really different than, you know, most of the time we think about recreational fishing as just, you know, a family going out and catching some fish to make dinner that night. So that might not have a huge impact, but a lot of types of recreational fishing do. Things like climate change from increasing CO2 in the atmosphere. This causes things like temperatures increasing, ocean acidification, potentially increases in storminess, changes in conditions. Things like agricultural runoff, especially in this area in Monterey County, we're really aware of this. You know, driving around Moss Landing, you see all of the agriculture right up against the coastline, and so you can imagine that that's causing lots of runoff into the area and potentially causing lots of areas of eutrophication. And then also things like sewage outfall. And so these are just a list of some of the ways that humans impact the environment. And so, you know, we think about how these things sort of add together, and so what that actually the consequences are. And if we think about this, you know, you have things like habitat destruction that then can cause increase in sediments and pollutants, which can lead to loss of seagrass habitat or other types of habitat, which can then lead to a decrease in fisheries, and has direct impacts on declining human well-being in coastal populations, which then can then as a consequence lead to us increasing our efforts even more. And so it's important for us to think about how all these different ways these different human impacts are impacting the ocean just on a purely biological and conservation sense, but then also sort of from a selfish sense of we really rely on a lot of marine resources for our well-being, for livelihoods, for just general recreation. So it's important for us to think about how we're impacting them and what those impacts are. So thinking about, you know, we really often think about each one of these impacts alone. So how does fishing impact the ocean, or how does pollution impact the ocean? But it's really important to think about how we measure all of these impacts together, how they sort of lay on top of each other and what the consequences are. So there was a group at NCEAS, at the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis, a while back that thought about how to map all of these together. And they created this global map of human impacts. And so what you can see here is they created this map where you have areas that have low impacts that have these cool colors, and areas of high impacts that have warm colors. And really the take-home message here is that everywhere is pretty much impacted in some way. And so I think this is a really striking way to think about how impacts are on the ocean, because you have, you know, it's just a really nice graphical image of showing how much we affect the oceans. And NCEAS is located in Santa Barbara, California, in California, inside the California Current ecosystem. And so we know the California Current ecosystem is this really healthy and really wonderful source of so much marine biodiversity. And so they wanted to think, can we take that global map and zoom it in and make a regional map? And so what they did is they created a cumulative impacts map for the California Current ecosystem. And when they divided all of these different impacts out, they thought about 4 general areas. Climate, so changes that are impacts that are related to climate change. Impacts related to land-based. This is basically like land-based pollution, agricultural runoff, things like that. Fishing pressures, both recreational fishing and commercial fishing. And then they had a catch-all category that they call other. And this includes things like shipping lanes, invasive species, aquaculture, things that just don't fit really nicely into the other category. So they don't necessarily have anything to do with each other. They just don't have anything to do with the other ones. So then they added all of those up together and created one impact map for all of the California Current ecosystem. And I think one of the things that Scott didn't tell you about my background is that after I finished my PhD at Hopkins Marine Station, I left the academic science world for a few years, and I worked as a fellow for a program called the West Coast Governors Alliance. And so this was basically an alliance of governors of the West Coast for Washington, Oregon, and California. That was the regional ocean partnership for the West Coast. And so this sort of foray into the policy world made me start thinking about science in a little bit of a different way. And really what I learned most about when I was working in the policy world was that I didn't want to be doing policy. I wanted to be doing the science that sort of informed policy, but it also gave me a different lens to look at science through. And so from that sort of policy angle, I look at a map like this and realize that it presents things in a really simple way, and it gives really simple numbers and really simple descriptions of sort of what the impact level is in different parts of California and Oregon and Washington, the California. And so these are exactly the types of, this is exactly the type of information that policymakers generally want. They want really simple, clear numbers. They don't want, you know, the data suggest, or this what might be going on, or this area might be more impacted than others. They want really simple information that's distilled down. You know, when I worked in the policy world, I worked at the Natural Resources Agency in Sacramento under the Assistant Secretary of Oceans. And at one point, you know, there was a paper that came out in Marine Policy, which seems like the type of journal that maybe marine policymakers would be open to reading, but they're not. And so there was a paper that came out about ocean acidification and ways that we could sort of start thinking about locally managing for ocean acidification based on regulations that are already in place in California, things like the Clean Water Act. But it was a really hard sell to even get them to listen to it because it was just too complicated. It was too much information. This is what they want. They want really simple information that's distilled down into beautiful graphics that are really clear. So from a policy perspective, this type of information is potentially really useful. But from a scientific perspective, I know and you know that distilling all of that complex information is a really difficult thing. And so really underneath these really simple measurements, so each one of these colors, each one of these pixels represents a single number. But really, it doesn't just represent one number. It represents this, it comes from this sort of semi-complicated but not that complicated looking equation. And so here you have for each pixel, you have the summation of the log transformed normalized impact, so some level of what the impact is, added times the presence or absence of a specific habitat, and then multiplied by a vulnerability score for that impact for that habitat. So it's a relatively, you can imagine that there are tons of assumptions that go into creating this equation. I think they really tried to do a very good job of trying to accommodate and think about the different types of complexities that go into this, realizing that not every impact impacts every habitat in exactly the same way. But there are tons of assumptions, and this is so much complex information that's distilled down into one number. And so I think from sort of, you know, thinking about my background in policy, I thought that this is really potentially very interesting, but how well does it actually affect reality or biology of different systems? And so with a group of scientists working at NCEAS and then also with folks at the Center for Ocean Solutions, we asked the question of, can indices of cumulative impacts be used to predict the status of coastal ecosystems? Do you actually see that in areas where we predict high impacts that the ecosystems aren't doing as well? Or is there no relevance at all? And so to do this, we used the large repository of data that they have at PSCO, the really long-term data set that extends most of the coast, the west coast of the United States. And we used both the intertidal data. So the intertidal is, you know, obviously this wealth of biodiversity, and it's a really easy place to go. It's very accessible. You can go out and collect a lot of data. And we also used the PSCO kelp forest ecosystem. So kelp forests also are highly valued ecosystems, centers of lots of biodiversity. And just as a side note, we already have some evidence to think that kelp forests might be affected by anthropogenic influences. For example, here's a map of San Nicolas Island, and here you can see the extent of the kelp forest in the red and the green from about 100 years ago. And then plotted on top of that is a map of the data of basically where there are kelp forests over the last 30 years. And you can see that over the last 30 years on San Nicolas Island, where there was kelp 100 years ago and where there is now match up pretty closely. And San Nicolas Island is pretty isolated. It's not, you know, there's still going to be some impacts of humans, but there's not people living out there, not people actively there. Whereas in Point Loma in Southern California, you can see this is the map of the extent of the kelp forest about 100 years ago. And mapped on top now is the extent of the kelp forest from over the last 30 years from Landsat data. And so you can see here there's two sections in the north and the south where there's no longer, in the last 30 years, we've never seen any kelp in these areas. And so this kelp forest in Southern California and Point Loma, in an area that has lots of urban development and potentially more anthropogenic impacts, the kelp forest has basically shrunk and become smaller. And so these areas here in this where it's circled are areas where we've never seen any kelp in 30 years, whereas 100 years ago there was kelp. So we wanted to do, so that's just sort of a side note, that we have reasons to think that kelp forests are likely impacted by anthropogenic forces. So what we did is we took the PISCO data and we thought about the intertidal and the subtidal, and we thought about what different sort of response variables we might want to look at. And I think it's really difficult to think about how to measure the status of an ecosystem. So what we did is for the intertidal and the subtidal, we used measures of biodiversity. And in general, we think that areas with more biodiversity tend to be sort of ecosystems that are in better shape, but that's not necessarily true by and large. So, it's really difficult to think of what the proper response variables are. But that's what we chose for the intertidal and the subtidal. And then we also chose a measure of fish biomass. And for the fish biomass, for the total fish biomass for each site, we used a measure of the most common fishes, the same fishes that were used in Scott's paper, looking at fish densities and abundances in the Channel Islands. So the other thing that we know already, as all of us are sort of ecologists thinking about these systems, is that we know that they might be affected by anthropogenic forces, but they're also definitely affected by lots of other forces. So we added into our model different physical factors. From PISCO, we got information on wave height and kelp density. We removed kelp from our data set and used that as a factor rather than a part of the response variable. Through the Natural Capital Invest project, we also got information on wave exposure, wind, surge, and then we also included some sea surface temperature data. So we already know that these things also affect kelp forests and intertidal ecosystems. And then we added in the cumulative impact values, and we kept these separated out by their 4 different groups: the climate, land, other, and fishing. So we were really curious to see if we looked at models to see the relative impact of these different factors, would we see that the cumulative impact indices were more important in predicting biodiversity and total fish biomass than just looking at physical factors alone. The other thing we know that affects these ecosystems is that they're not uniform along the entire coast of the California current. So we also know that there are lots of different biogeographic regions. And so this is just an MDS plot of the intertidal and also the subtidal, and you can see that these different regions, the Channel Islands are in yellow and blue, and then you have the northern areas that are in red and orange, and you can see that these break apart by bioregion. So we also incorporated bioregion into our model because we know that some of these differences could be driven just by which sites are closer together than which sites are farther apart. And the bioregions we used came from Carol Blanchett's paper that used the PISCO intertidal data to subdivide the entire California current into different bioregions based on the intertidal data. So just to give you an idea of what we did is we assembled a series of linear mixed effects models. And we did this at 2 different scales. We did it at a local scale and also at a regional scale. So for the entire West Coast, we looked at the effect of diversity in biomass as a factor of the different cumulative impact indices submodels, looking at wind and wave height, kelp biomass, bioregion, and year. And so for intertidal diversity, this spanned all the way from Washington down to San Diego. And then for kelp forest diversity, it was a little bit smaller of a range from Oregon down to San Diego. And the same for total fish biomass, because those data came from similar data sets from the PISCO subtidal data. And then we also chose a local scale to look at, just sort of looking within one of the bioregions. And so here, bioregion is no longer a random factor in the model. We also included year as a random factor because things could be different from year to year, not just because of different conditions. So here we looked at diversity or biomass as a factor of the different cumulative impact indices submodels, wind and wave, kelp and wave height, and also year. And for intertidal data, we used here in Monterey, California, in the Monterey Bay as our submodel, as our local model. And then for kelp forest diversity and for fish biomass, we used the Southern California Bight. And just as a side note, These are what the cumulative impact indices look like around the Monterey Bay. You can see that they range from about a 7 to a 13. So we have a pretty good range of the cumulative impact indices. The cumulative impact indices for the entire California current in intertidal ecosystems range from about a score of 4 to 15. So we don't encompass the entire range within the Monterey Bay area, but we do encompass a pretty good snippet of it. So just to remind you, we were looking at the response variables of intertidal and kelp forest diversity and fish biomass as factors of these physical factors and also the cumulative impact indices. And we were really curious specifically to think which ones, so what we were able to look at is the relative importance of each of these different factors. And so we were really curious, are we going to see that relatively the physical factors are more important or that the cumulative impact indices really dominate, and that's part of what's driving these differences between these ecosystems. So I'm going to walk you through a series of graphs that are going to look like this. So I'm just going to show you what they mean. So here we have the different factors over here. And some of them, unfortunately, have not useful names. REI stands for Relative Exposure Index. So it's basically a wind exposure index. And then you have the different submodels, climate, land, other, and fishing, and then all the physical factors. So then the factors will also then be ordered by level of AICC weight. So that's a weighting of which ones are most important. And what we did is we did model averaging. So we ran every iteration of the model. So the model had all of these different factors included in it, the cumulative impact indices and the physical factors and the random factors of bioregion and year. And we ran every possible iteration. So we included just the cumulative, each cumulative index on its own, and then also paired with all of the physical, and ran every possible iteration of all of those factors. And so then what you can do is you can average, you can look at the standardized estimate for each of those, for every single model run, and see if they never overlap 0 and they're on the positive side, then that implies a positive relationship of that factor and the different impact or the different response variables. If in every single iteration of the model it never overlaps 0 and on the negative side, then that implies a negative relationship between those factors and our response variables. And if it overlaps 0, then it implies no relationship. So we can't necessarily say anything about it. So again, these are using linear mixed effects models where we did model averaging. So we looked at all of the potential iterations of the model and then looked to see over all of those runs of the model, where do they fall out as far as their standardized estimates and the AIC scores. So for the West Coast, for Rocky Intertidal, we see that the things that fall out as the most important are climate, wave exposure, and wave height at the West Coast level, whereas at the Central Coast level, just looking in the Monterey Bay area, we see that climate and surge are the most important. So here we see climate is important at both of these levels. And we have more at the regional level. We also have wave height, and at the local level, we have surge. And I think the other thing to remember is that where these, that the cumulative impact indices had to make a lot of assumptions, like I said before, when they created all of these indices. And their climate values are really tied to latitude. So if you plotted latitude and cumulative impact indices for climate for the cumulative impact indices, you get a really high correlation. So it's possible that this pattern could be driven by latitude just as much as it is by climate. So we can't decouple those things because of the way the NCs group created these cumulative impact indices. So for kelp forest diversity, at the West Coast level, we see that relative exposure index, wave exposure, and then also land, fishing, and climate come out as important. And then at the Southern California Bight, we see the square root of kelp density. So kelp density is very important for predicting biodiversity at the local level. And then fishing and wave exposure and sea surface temperature. So here we see at the regional level that the cumulative impact indices seem to be more important at the regional level than the local level, which is sort of not surprising given that a lot of these factors, when they created the cumulative impact indices, they had to use a lot of data that had a really large scales to create, even though they distilled them down into small pixels, to small geographic pixels, a lot of the data they used to incorporate it were actually at the scale of a few kilometers or something. So for fish biomass, at the West Coast level, we see fishing is the most important, and for me, that was really important to see, because I would say that if fishing didn't fall out as important for fish biomass, then there was really something going wrong with their cumulative impact indices. We also see that land, relative exposure, wave exposure, other, and square root of kelp density are important at the West Coast level. And then at the Southern California Bight level, we see that other is the most important, fishing and land are also important. And one of the things that pops out as being really strange, I think, in these graphs is that you see that the other is positive. And so usually when we think about impact values, we think about them having negative impacts. And that comes out as really positive and really important in the Southern California Bight. But like I said, the other category is sort of this catch-all category of things like shipping lanes, invasive species. And if you know anything about the Southern California Bight, you know that the Channel Islands tend to be closer to shipping lanes. And so it's possible, and there are lots of fish at the Channel Islands. So it's possible that this is being driven just by sort of random chance proximity of shipping lanes to the Channel Islands where there are more fish. So I don't know, I mean, to me, the fact that the other comes out as positive is really strange. But I think it could be something going on, something like that, where you have shipping lanes are closer to the Channel Islands, where you have fish. And then the last thing we looked at with these models was also we looked at the conditional R squared. And so you can see for both of these, or for these, that for fish biomass, when we look at the whole model, it performs equally well at the local and regional scale. Whereas for kelp diversity, we see that there's a much better performance and the whole model is including the physical parameters and also the cumulative impact indices. And so you can see that it's possible that thinking about these cumulative impact indices, it makes more sense at a regional level than at a local level. And that also makes a lot of sense because the types of data that went into creating the cumulative impact indices were all sort of large-scale data that then got distilled down to really small geographical levels. And then the other thing to notice from this is that none of these R-squared values are particularly good. So even though, all the things I was showing you before were just sort of relative importance, that this is relatively more important than that. But none of these models really fit the data very well. So there's obviously a lot other factors that are more important for governing kelp forests and intertidal. We also spent a little bit of time thinking about indicator species. So obviously, biodiversity is not necessarily the best response variable to be looking at because it's unclear. And the other thing I should mention is that we use the PSCO data to create indices of biodiversity, but nobody went out and measured every single thing that was out there. So whether or not that's really an accurate measure of biodiversity is sort of difficult to say. So I think it's really important to remember that these response variables we were looking at are not perfect. So we sort of tried to take a way to look at this and see if there was any relationship to things that we think about as being important in kelp forests and intertidal ecosystems. But we don't have data on all of the biodiversity out there, so we tried to do the best we could. So in the rocky intertidal, when we thought about indicator species, we thought about mussels, coralline algae, and bare rock. And then in kelp forests, we thought about kelp, and this includes understory kelp and macrocystis, and nereocystis in the northern part of the California current, and also urchins. And so I'm just going to quickly show you some of the kelp data. So when we thought about kelp forest indicator species, so here I'm showing you the data in a little bit different way. I'm ranking them in terms of the AICC score. So AICC is sort of an idea of how well the model fits the data. So the lower the score, the better the fit. So when you see for urchins, that when you have the whole model, which includes both the physical and the impact indices, that's the best fit according to the AIC scores. And then the physical data is a slightly better fit than that, or a slightly less better fit, and then just the impact indices alone is the worst fit. But these are all really close. They're all really close to each other. They're not falling apart as majorly different. And so then if we look at kelp, we see that the physical factors are the best fit, followed by the whole model. So basically what this is telling us is that if we look at just physical factors and we leave out the cumulative impact indices, the model fits the data better. And then the whole model comes next, and then cumulative impact indices alone are the worst fit. So the take-home from these data, I think, are that you see differences at local versus regional scales, that the model tends to perform a bit better at regional scales than local scales, and that cumulative impact indices seem to be a little bit more informative at the regional scale. That there are many times where the physical factors outperform impact models, and so maybe just going out and looking at physical factors alone might be more useful than trying to measure impact values and the impact indices in these really complicated ways. And so I think these cumulative impact indices are informative. I think they identify areas that are highly impacted versus not super impacted. And I think that's a good thing. It's really useful from a policy and management perspective. But I also think they should be used cautiously. They shouldn't just be taken up right into conservation and management policies without considering the complexity that they represent. And then I just wanted to talk about another small little project that we did sort of within this. So this summer I had an REU student working with me named Enrique Espiritu, who's from Guam. So she came here from Guam and got to see kelp for the first time ever, and got to sort of think about, she was really interested in how different anthropogenic impacts impact marine resources. And so what we did is we used the Landsat database. So the Landsat database is a satellite data set, and the Landsat satellites travel all over the globe taking aerial pictures. And so every 16 days, a picture gets taken of different areas. And from these Landsat images, you can actually see kelp around California. And so there's a group at UC Santa Barbara that has gone through and created an algorithm to translate this sort of the number of pixels that fluoresce as kelp cover versus land versus water into biomass of kelp canopy. And so what she did, she was particularly interested in the effects of fishing and pollution. And so we circled back and used the cumulative impact indices to try and see if we would see any correlations between kelp cover and cumulative impact and the impact indices of certain pieces. So she used fishing, she used both recreational and commercial fishing, and then she used pollution, not all the land-based pieces, but she just looked at pollution. And so what she found some significant negative, but very, very small correlations between the impacts of pollution and kelp biomass. So you can see here it's very, very small, a really small negative correlation. But we wouldn't expect to see a large correlation because we know that kelps are affected by so many different things. And we also saw a small negative impact of fishing. So I think even though these cumulative impact indices should be taken with a grain of salt, I do think that there's useful data within them to think about things on a really large scale. And I think here we used just the raw cumulative impact data, so we didn't use the sort of the vulnerability indices and everything that went along with them that made them sort of more assumptions taken into place. But I think the cumulative impact indices are really useful, and it's really a way to sort of think about how different things might be affecting oceans. But I think you want to be careful when you use them and use them very cautiously. So with that, I'd like to acknowledge these people and take any questions.
It sounds like it's like a risk assessment. Were you part of the?
I know a little bit about it, but I wasn't part of it.
Because yes, the map is pretty, but I've always wondered how the folks in the room sit around and go, is this a 10 or is this a 5? Should we scale this 1 to 10 logarithmically, exponentially?
And I think that's part of why, I wasn't part of the process, and so I think that's part of why I try to be really careful, because I'm not in the interest of tearing things down. I think they did a really good job of trying to incorporate a lot of complexity. into simple numbers. And part of where the vulnerability scores came from is that they did interviews with scientists in different areas to try and get an idea of what the best knowledge available was of how much certain impacts impact specific habitats. So I think they tried to do a really good job of trying to incorporate lots of complexity, but of course there are tons of assumptions that go into that. And yeah, I can't tell, I wasn't in the room, so I can't tell you that part.
Yeah, but nobody tries to do a bad job.
No, it's true.
Because my eye, I had the beautiful map of California with where the colors went from extremes and I could see them. It seemed to me, if I were just to interpret it, I'd go, if you're on the beach, you're going to be affected, and if you're not, you're not. Mm-hmm. And that was what I concluded.
Yeah, definitely along the coast, there are impacts, which is not shocking.
But then I thought you were telling us to look regionally, and so I tried to mentally, and I saw blue to the north and orange to the south or something like that in open water, yellow to the north and green to the south, I guess. But I noticed that, so that looks to me like a pattern, separated, of course, right at good old Point Conception, where everything seems to have, the world revolves around that point. And but I find, but the distinct color is right in the center of your cumulative impact score, where it's a coin toss whether you're in the middle left or middle right. And so I don't know if it's meaningful. Is it meaningful?
I don't know. I mean, and that's, I think that, we've done a lot of work trying to decide if it's meaningful, and my answer is sort of, I don't know, but probably we should err on the side of being skeptical.
Do you ever desire to be in the room where they figure out all those scores? And
I mean, I would like to see how it is that the process actually happens, but to be honest, I think that it's such a difficult job to try and do it. I think that, those conversations must go around in circular worlds for days. And at some point, somebody has to make a decision. You have to make a decision or else you can't move forward. And so that's why I try, I don't think that I could do a better job. And so I try to be very conscious of that. But I think maybe, I think maybe they're in the presentation of it, sort of being a little bit more upfront about some of the assumptions and rather than presenting it as like, this is exactly how it is, which I think is sometimes how it gets presented.
Well, you could make a decision that this is just totally useless and dissolve the workshop and go home.
Good, yeah, you could make that decision.
Right, so the question I have about your analyses, where you matched up ecosytes with physical phenomena. So when you measure waves and all that stuff, did you measure them right at the site where they sampled?
No, so all of the physical data come from models.
Right,
so they're not actual measurements.
I mean, I think it's been well, at least recently, pretty well understood that local physical phenomena are very great. And so, again, you wonder, the utility of that exercise, all it does really is prove that you can't use even fairly large-scale physical phenomena to predict local diversity. And I find that is not surprising at all.
And I think that is, that would be one of my main take-home messages, is that, I think that as ecologists, we keep searching for like the magic thing you can look at a regional level and make local predictions, but you just can't. Right. And that I think what's useful about what? Well, yeah, maybe. I think I did my PhD using population genetics to look at larval dispersal, and I chose something that had a really short PLD and a really long PLD, thinking like, okay, I'm going to go out and then I'm going to be able to make recommendations that all species with long PLDs should be managed like this, and all species with short PLDs should be managed like this. But as I moved on with my PhD, I realized that you were never going to be able to say those things. It was always going to have to be that you're going to have to collect data on specific species. And then there may be some generalizations that you can make, but by and large, there's just exceptions to everything. And I think the utility of a map like this is that you can identify areas that might be more heavily impacted, and then maybe say like, okay, we should go there and find out more.
But I would say that people that work in the field know that anyway.
Yeah.
I don't think you need an NC's workshop to figure that out.
I wouldn't disagree. Corey?
So, kind of following up on that, because I was a postdoc in the EMAP program many years ago. This is what they did. That was what they were tasked with by the EPA, and they figured this out, over 10 years ago. So I'm kind of curious, kind of getting your insight, why are they still kind of taking this approach where they just lump stuff together when there's been this massive body of literature showing all the kind of pitfalls you can run into if you try to do that?
Yeah, I don't know. I find that when I talk about this data, usually most of the sort of feedback and things I get are comments about the model themselves, which I can't do anything about them. And I think part of my motivation for trying to look at this a little bit more carefully is to say, like, is this really that useful? And my answer is, on some level, yes, but on many levels, no. And I think that you have to be just really cautious and really careful when you're thinking about just looking at this and saying, like, okay, that's the story, when a lot of the information is already known from multiple different types of sources, from people with local knowledge. And they tried, I mean, that was one of the things they did when they created these indices, is they tried to incorporate as much local knowledge as they could. But then, why do you, maybe you don't need to create this large-scale map if you're just basically trying to do everything at the local level anyway. So I don't know.
Just kind of a follow-up on that. You made the comment that they go out and they ask all the scientists what they think. Do they actually ever got into community? So like thinking about like Alaska, they go into like some of the historic tribes that are there talking what they think are important.
So there's a paper by Sarah Tech that talks more about the process, ecological applications, that talks more about the process of assigning the vulnerability scores. And I think that they used expert opinion. And expert, I think, was a relatively loose definition. So sometimes it was scientists and sometimes it was people with local knowledge. But I can't remember exactly.
I really like what you're trying to do here, and I know you can't defend the original process, because I believe that the biases of the people in the room greatly influence the outcomes. But you've got a data set that you're using to test their assumptions. I was wondering if you could take some information, such as simple parameters such as the density of people along the coast, or the numbers of boats operating at the coast, and throw their results away and use some of your own to test against your data
so
set.
that's actually something that I'm trying to do some work with my postdoc work that I haven't finished yet. So through my postdoc work, I've been trying to do some work quantifying urban impacts or urbanization or coastal impacts. And it's really hard to think about how to map what's going on land exactly to the ocean and think about, where does it all come together? You can't exactly count, the number of people that are in each pixel because the pixels are in water. And so what I've done is I've taken a watershed approach to that and tried to quantify things like population density, impervious surface cover, agricultural cover, developed land, and quantify all of those at each watershed, and then put those sort of on top of this. And it would be interesting to try and see how those correlate to the impact indices. But what I've been doing is doing a little bit of work with the Landsat data set. So there's 30 years of kelp cover data available from San Francisco down to San Diego. They don't go north of San Francisco because north of San Francisco there's so much more nereocystis, and so the algorithm to get biomass is much hairier. And so I've seen I've done a structural equation model to try and see what the relative importance is of those things. And I've seen some negative. It's still really preliminary, and I need to do more work on it. But there are potentially some negative impacts of population density and agriculture, and a few of the other things that you might expect.
Yeah, I would think number of outfalls in the watershed, for instance.
Yeah, and so that data I haven't quite figured out how to incorporate number of outfalls yet, but I think it's something that would make sense to add.
So, and I also appreciate the approach of trying to figure out the utility of someone else's model working with someone else's data. And the way you've driven this, it's mostly are these forcing variables affecting diversity in these three systems the way you did, the two diversities in the biomass. The other way to potentially look at it is to actually take the ecological data, per se, and look at studies, for example, Barron's and Lafferty's work, where they used ecological data, not the anthropogenic data, to characterize kelp forest health. Put that on a scale, and then go into that system and say, now look, here's a healthy kelp forest, and here's an unhealthy kelp forest based on ecological data. What does the impact score look like?
Yeah, I think that's another really good way to think about it, because then you're sort of scaling things equally. And we are really, I mean, I think at this point we sort of feel like we're spinning our wheels and not really, I mean, and I think that we're trying to do something, but yeah, we're using somebody else's model and somebody else's data. And I think that's a really good idea to try and think about assessing the health and then seeing do all healthy ecosystems fall in areas that are bluer, and do all unhealthy ones fall in areas that are redder? And that would be another good way.
Because I think what you get is you get a lot of ecologists that know these systems. They know the data, they know the site, they get in there. They trust that data far more.
Yeah.
So if you tell them, hey, Point Loma is big, but in fact, Point Loma is pretty darn, you know, it's not very diverse, it's not very even, whereas you get to San Nicolas Island or you get to San Miguel Island and it's much nicer. In that regard, most ecologists buy that.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you show a histogram and say, look, Point Loma is listed as a highly impacted system versus San Nicolas is not, I mean, that helps.
Makes sense.
But if all of a sudden you get to a really healthy kelp forest, and this says it's not supposed to be, I think that will help register that for the
I
audience.
think that's a really, I really like that suggestion.
So you said that you started, sort of this idea of thinking if you can help policy. And doesn't this kind of stuff actually show, and kind of a lot of the discussion, that really the policy needs to be worried about is on a local level.
Mm-hmm.
People understand, I mean, there are fisheries regulations go all over the place, sewer regulations, whole state, there's a lot of things that are statewide. But local stuff, it seems to me that it may be wise to encourage policymakers to diversify and think about local problems.
And I think that's sort of the take-home message that I've taken from so many different projects that I've worked on, that as much as it would be nice to make these really wide sweeping regional statements, that the local, in the local level is where things really get done when it comes from conservation and restoration. The local level is where things are often happening, and I think it's where we trust our data the most. And so I definitely agree. I think the local level is what often makes sense. And I think that for a lot of policy projects, there's a lot of laws and legislation that it gets enacted at the state level. But then it still comes to managers at the local level who are the ones that enforce it. And I think so there's still a fair amount, even though most of our laws and our legislative process happens at the state level, I think there's still a lot of possibility for things happening at the local level. Any other questions?